Welcome, my friend, to the On the Blue Line podcast for law enforcement. This is your host, Wayne Mulder, and this is the podcast where we help law enforcement overcome the mental health toll of the profession to become better leaders and protectors on and off the job. This is the 101st episode, and this week, law enforcement will either save the Republic or they will lose it. Morning roll call starts now.
'Cause you know it's only gonna get better. Yeah, the seasons know when to change. Better weather don't last
leadership in the face of just...
And there's, dissenting opinions and arguments, and, we may have to wait. Welcome, my friend, to the On the Blue Line podcast. I'm so happy to be back with you again this week. I cannot wait until the day that I could actually do a daily show, which I can bring you information in a more timely fashion. But for the time being, once a week, actually twice a week, once a week, it's you and I sitting down for this, which is called Morning Roll Call. And on Thursdays, we sit down in the interview room with a guest from all walks of life. Make sure you go back. If you haven't listened to last week's episode with Joe Gamaldi, the National Vice President of the FOP, fantastic episode. I'm telling you, you will enjoy the things he said. I love his passion. He is also up for a vote for that position this month at the national conference in Vegas. So if you are involved in that, if you're part of the FOP, make sure that you are taking into consideration that vote. And I would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. And this week is another great guest. I know I say that about all of them, but they really are. But this week, it's also a good friend, Scott Ferguson. He has the Time to Shine Today podcast, radio show. And just that name alone, right? Time to Shine Today. I mean, how can you not get encouraged? And I tell you, just everything about his persona and the things that we talk about are going to encourage you. And it's definitely another episode you are not going to want to miss. So real quick, a couple orders of business. If you're not following us on Twitter or X or Twix or whatever the heck Elon Musk is calling it, be sure to go over there. It's at On the Blue Line and the number one. So at On the Blue Line and the number one. And then we're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Rumble, and even the Chinese communist TikTok. Yes, all of them at On the Blue Line Podcast, On the Blue Line Podcast. And be sure to leave us a rating or review wherever you stream or watch this. 5-star rating does a big, it's a big help for the algorithm. So please, I encourage you to do that. So this week, I'm doing something a little bit different. I wanted to just sit here and have a quick conversation with you. I had posted and if you're watching this online, you'll see some of this come up on the video screen. Again, every episode is on YouTube and Rumble. But I want to go over, really just talk about one thing. Instead of going over some different news stories, they'll all feed into this. But I want to talk about a tweet or an X, or again, whatever we're calling it, that I put out this week that got feedback. It got a little bit of traction, and some people agreed with it. A lot of people were like, well, what do you mean by that? Will you go a little bit deeper? So I thought it's an important enough thing that I wanted to really come in here and go a little bit deeper into what did I mean when I put this out. So I tweeted back on the 1st. Over the last few hours, the stark divide in this country has been on display wider than ever. Trending battles fought on keyboards for now. So this was in reference to what happened this week, right? So we had the 3rd indictment of Donald Trump, I think. Again, that's not the point of this. I don't really want to go down that road right now because it doesn't bring anything good for what the focus of this podcast is. But I will say this, that even lifelong registered Democrats like Alan Dershowitz are coming out and saying that these aren't passing what he calls the Banana Republic test. So do more research on it, draw your own conclusions, but all indications are that, and essentially what he means by the Banana Republic test is that going after this individual in this prominent position, who's your political rival, who is the front runner of your political rival party, and what you're charging them with doesn't rise to the level that justifies that engagement, is essentially what he's saying. And so that's what he's putting out there. But what happened, right? Especially if you're on a platform like Twitter, well, everybody loses their mind on both sides of the equation. So you have all this divisiveness that comes on. Ironically, even among each side, there's divisiveness growing. So you have this huge thing of not only the divisiveness that splits the country between those that believe he should be prosecuted and those that clearly believe that this is going after your political rivals, but then within, say, just the Republican Party, you have this split between these people that are completely on board with still Trump being the front runner and are losing their mind that anybody's even considering others like DeSantis or so forth. There really isn't anyone else in the race that should be considered, but other than like DeSantis. So this is creating all sorts of backlash, and you're getting all of this divisive content coming up, and you have all these people, you know, oh, we're in a cold civil war. Oh, we're in this battle. We're in this. So this is what's going on online. So I'm seeing this, and I put out, hey, listen, over the last few hours, this has all been a stark divide. But then I say that my concern is with law enforcement. So I then qualify that with, most of you know law enforcement as the thin blue line, right? As my flag right behind me here represents. That's the thin blue line. Well, what is the thin blue line? Well, the thin blue line comes from this idea that law enforcement is the line or the division or the safety net, if you would, between civility and anarchy. So if you have on one side civility and you have one side anarchy, who's in the middle? Well, you saw it firsthand this last weekend if you watched the complete insanity that happened in New York. Who were they throwing rocks at? Who were they going after? Who were they charging after, right? Well, they were charging after law enforcement. The law enforcement was trying to get away. They were holding up shields and stuff, and the people were still attacking them, all because of what this social influencer was doing. So who is that dividing line between the citizens who were just trying to run their businesses in New York that day and the complete chaos and anarchy that came to the city? Well, it's law enforcement, right? I mean, it's simple. So as these battle lines, and I'm reading again from my post, as these battle lines are drawn more clearly and resolutely, as I observed today, the job of law enforcement will only get harder. This is probably one of the topics I'm most passionate about. Why? Why is this one of the topics that I'm most passionate about? Aren't you a mental health podcast? Isn't this all about, law enforcement officers? You even say that this is about decreasing or getting the law enforcement life expectancies to be equal with the general population. What does that mean? Well, that means that on average, law enforcement officers pass away 15 years earlier, by some estimates, 15 to 20, earlier than the general population. So the purpose of this podcast is to help with these mental health issues, to help with this holistic viewpoint. And when I use the word holistic, I mean it in the sense that mind, body, spirit, like we are created beings that have a spirit, right? So we're more than just the physical body that I am sitting here behind this desk talking to you. So why am I so passionate about this topic? Because this topic leads to the mental health. When law enforcement don't feel supported, when you are in your agencies and you don't feel like the agency has your back, when you don't feel like the community has your back, when you're looking at a national scale and you are hearing the complete insanity of things like defund the police and we want to reimagine law enforcement, we want to reimagine everything. When you are hearing that divisive rhetoric, does that not affect the mental health of law enforcement officers? Does that not lead to the uptick of violence like we saw this weekend with the more shootings and the shootings we had in Orlando and others across the nation? I believe we had some in Louisiana. I mean, the numbers are staggering. I had Joe Grimaldi on my podcast, and that interview was probably about a month and a half ago that we sat down and did that interview. In those 6 to 8 weeks since that podcast came out, the numbers that he goes over in that interview have gone up exponentially. We have a war on law enforcement in this country. So when I talk about the divisiveness, when I talk about the republic, when I talk about these things breaking apart, this is core to whether or not, to the mental health of our men and women on the front lines. So, as being one of the topics that I'm most passionate about, as the degradation of Western society continues, law enforcement is going to find itself in a precarious situation. Law enforcement is the face of the government at the local level, while being the ones charged with maintaining the peace for law-abiding citizens. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's back to the thin blue line. Nobody's going to come to your house who's making these rules and dictates and has completely lost their mind. It isn't Joe Biden just to use because he's the current president of the United States. Joe Biden, even though he keeps threatening to come and get your guns, isn't going to come to your house and knock on your door and take your firearms. The ATF will. I'm not saying they're going to. I'm just saying that if we get to a point in society where these are the dictates that are coming down and law enforcement is going to take action on those dictates, who do you think is going to do it? Who do you think is the enforcement arm? You know, let's just hypothetically say you have a political rival and you want to serve a warrant on their house, or say their country club, or say their large organization. Who's going there and getting the boxes and taking everything out of there? It isn't the people in Washington that are making these decisions. It's law enforcement that's got to carry that out. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is law enforcement's going to find itself in this precarious situation. They are the face of the government. They're the ones that are saying, you know what, I swore to uphold the law, and if this is law, if this is what's required of me, I'm going to go out and do it. And on its face, that's not a bad thing, right? That, in fact, that's a good thing. Like, that's literally the job of law enforcement. Here, I'll give you a clue what those words mean. It means one who enforces the law. So in a functioning, healthy republic where we have laws that are put into place by men and women who are representatives, we're a representative republic. What does that mean? We send representatives. I don't have time, you don't have time to go and run everything in my little world. So what do, right? So the purpose of government is to say, listen, I have to have a life outside of trying to keep peace, of trying to keep people off my property, keeping people from stealing from me, try and guarantee people don't take the lives of my wife and my children, right? So we relinquish those roles to government. Governments are instituted among men for one reason only, and it is to protect the rights of the governed. So law enforcement finds itself in this precarious situation where they are the ones that are the face of the government. So when people are mad at the government, who are they mad at? Typically law enforcement. Who are they going to take it out on? Typically law enforcement. So law enforcement is put into a really tough position. Take a look at this. Let's look, if you haven't seen this video, differing thoughts, differing so forth. But if you haven't seen this video of the Marcus Schrader arrest, he's the street preacher that was preaching at a drag queen event in Wisconsin. All right, so let's watch this video.
Serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another.
Hey, what are you doing?
What is the problem?
I'm on vacation. What are you doing? What's wrong with you? What are you doing? I just think that my hand. You didn't give him any warning. You just grabbed the mic.
No, this is the same one that we had in here.
Yeah, that was in there. It was not out here. What is wrong with you? What are you doing? You didn't give us any warning.
Let it go. You guys have been warned. They say we can they say we can speak out here on the sidewalk freely.
You can speak, but there's no amplified device.
Nobody told us that.
What are you doing? Nobody told me that.
How come there's no amplification?
What's this?
Hey, you guys are acting like thugs, man. You're acting like straight up thugs.
Hey, you're taking away my property.
He has every right to be out here engaging in speech. He has every right to be out here engaging in speech.
All right. So let me preface this by saying, do I agree with what the drag queens and them were doing? No. If they were twerking on children, should they have been shut down? Absolutely. Those are all conversations that these guys that feel pretty, we can have those conversations later. However, that's not the point of what I'm trying to show here. So a couple things, right? So is it possible that they have some ordinance there on the amplification? It's not clear that that's what's happening here. But the point that I want, so I don't know, right? So I don't know, maybe they do have a policy against amplification and that's what these guys did. Maybe they have some sort of other county ordinance that said, hey, you can't be here, you got to be there. None of that's clear in this video. The officers don't really explain a whole lot. And of course, the one guy who's videoing it is kind of becoming a jerk. And then you can't really, you understand what law enforcement's trying to do here because, again, as peacekeepers, and you've got this guy being kind of a jerk, you've just got to separate and get everybody out of the area. So, fine. We've all been there and kind of understand the position you're put in. But then Marcus Schrader comes out and he talks about the event, and I think he has some really good things to say. Let's hear what he has to say.
Intolerance is an interesting word. Tolerance, intolerance, hatred, love, bigotry, things like that. Because really every culture has something that it's intolerant towards and something that it's tolerant of. I mean, there are things like murder and rape and stealing and just crimes that we are intolerant towards as a society. And so every society has something it's intolerant towards. The question is just, what is our object of intolerance and what is our object of tolerance? When I showed up Saturday, all I did was read from Scripture on the sidewalk. I read from the Bible, Galatians. And by the way, I wasn't reading Romans 1. I wasn't reading any passage that spoke against homosexuality or anything like that. I was reading a passage from the Bible about love. And I was arrested. No reason, not given any warning, not told anything about my amplification needing to be turning down. I was arrested and taken into custody simply for reading the Bible on the sidewalk. You see, as we become more and more tolerant of sexual immorality in our culture, we become more and more intolerant towards Christian morality. And the more we become intolerant towards Christian morality, the more we're going to see lawlessness in our streets. We were called a hate group. We were told that we don't want to understand the other side, and I just want to set the record straight. I am more than happy to have that conversation with the other side. I've sat down and had hours of discussions with LGBTQ activists. I completely understand the other side. I want to understand the other side. But drag queens twerking on kids in lingerie is unacceptable, and that's something that we have to notice as a culture. We can have our disagreements, but there comes a time when we have to understand that we are all going to stand before God one day. And we're going to have to give an account for what we have done with the children in our society, the innocent minds and the children who deserve to be protected.
So I think Marcus makes some really good points here. And he really is kind of being, now granted, this was made later, so things had calmed down and he was able to come out and make this statement. But a lot of what he says here is very correct and is absolutely true. In fact, it's kind of a choose ye this day kind of argument, right? Which side of this equation are we going to be on? But my point with all this is not necessarily whether law enforcement was right or whether Marcus was right or somewhere in the middle. My point with it is, as these type of things unfold, who do you think is responding? Law enforcement. That's right. They're the ones that are getting the call. They're the ones that are going to go out to these scenes. They're the ones that are going to have to try to keep the peace. So what happens if it gets worse and worse? So I next say that the reality is that more than ever, law enforcement must attract, develop, and support those who are grounded in truth, willing to serve in humility, and those who will stand by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights no matter the cost. And then I go on to say, we live in a time of moral decay, relativism, and celebrated paganism. The battle and what will be needed cannot be accomplished without firmly being grounded in faith and truth. So I showed this picture yesterday. This is from the craziness over the weekend. And you have on here some female up on this light post or street post, whatever, twerking with her hind end hanging out. And the only thing I could think of in that moment was John Adams' quote that our system of government requires a moral and religious people. We are so far away from who we as a people should be to support the republic that that was a gift, right? You know, it's a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it, right? So we see that what needs to be accomplished cannot be accomplished if we don't stand in faith and in truth. What does that mean? Well, it means what is actually true. It kind of goes back to what Marcus was saying a few minutes ago, right? There are absolutes. There are things that are absolutely not acceptable in society. And if we can't agree on that, if it's all moral relativism, you do you and I do me, you know, we're all this libertarian mindset. I have nothing against my libertarian brothers and sisters. And when it comes to taxes, we probably agree more than we disagree. But there are certain moral absolutes. And we have to be able to foundationally agree on those. So then I go on to say, support the police is not some mantra that is used as a half-hearted rallying cry. Rather, it is a reminder of the critical role citizens play as the actual head of a law enforcement agency. Remember that we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. You're the boss. I think sometimes agencies, law enforcement, they forget this part, right? You, the citizen, are the boss. right? You're the head. If we were going to put this on some sort of hierarchy chart, citizens, then whoever that chief or head of that agency is. Because you, in America, in this republic, in this healthy republic, the citizens are in charge. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, right? That's who it is. It's we, it's us. So then I go on, pray for police, support good law enforcement officers, but demand training, leadership development, and professionalism. Why is that? Because this is the whole fallacy of those who espouse things like defund the police. On one hand, you're complaining about what law enforcement does, and on the other hand, you're saying, well, we can't fund them. We don't want to give them any resources to train and put the people in the places we want. See, here's the problem when society attacks its good law enforcement officers. You end up with the ones in those positions that aren't qualified to do the job. I know this is hard to hear. I know this is, but this whole thing, well, law enforcement protects its own, or law enforcement, protects bad cops and so forth. That is absolutely not true in most situations. I can't speak to every situation. I can't speak to everything broadly across the country, but in general, that is not an absolutely true statement. Law enforcement often polices its own better than the public itself. Now, there's things that we disagree on because based on training and experience, we see it differently. There's a different view that we see it through. But law enforcement typically polices itself better. And that's what we want more of. So the problem is if we create an environment where good cops are leaving, then what you're left with are people who shouldn't be wearing the badge and doing the job. And what does that lead to? Well, I have that answer for you in just a moment. So I continue that unless a miracle happens, law enforcement will one day have the opportunity to have been the greatest protectors of American freedom. So if things don't change, law enforcement has an opportunity to have been the greatest protectors of American freedom, or the means by which it is finally lost. So here's what I want to say, and I got to be very careful when I go down this road, because the minute you go down this road, people lose their dang minds, and heads explode, and it just gets very, very, very crazy. But first, I want to say that that will never happen here mentality works right up until it finally happens here, right? It will never happen here. There's no chance they're going to shut down your businesses, that large corporations are going to be the only ones that are allowed to stay open, that in a country that has freedom of religion, the churches will be required to shut because the state said so. That could never, ever happen here. Hello? See, that argument is a fallacy. It's an absolute fallacy. It can happen here. So how do we keep it from happening? Well, first of all, we learn from history. We pay attention to what the heck is going on, and then we stand up for truth, right? So I'm going to read something that is probably not going to go over well, because every time you bring up a Holocaust reference, I know, I can hear it already, click, click, click. Every time you bring up a Holocaust reference, people lose their damn minds. But as one of the commentators I listen to a lot says, and I love how he says this, he goes, if there are signs that could keep us from going down the road to Naziville, maybe we should listen to them. And I happen to agree with him. That's Stu Berger with Blaze TV. And he often talks about maybe we should stay off the road to Naziville. That's not a bad idea. There are lessons from history that we can learn, right? So this comes from the Holocaust Encyclopedia and talks about the role of police. And I just want to read a couple things here. I'm not drawing conclusions. I'm in no way comparing what's going on in America to what happened in 1930s Germany. I'm just asking you to listen with open mind and open ears to this, especially if you haven't heard some of these historical references. Something else I want to mention to you, if you've never read the book by Christopher Browning, Ordinary Men, I strongly suggest you look it up. There'll be a link in the show notes below, but the book goes much deeper into exactly what I'm talking about here. So this is quoting, and again, this comes from the Holocaust Encyclopedia, the role of the German police. Before the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, there was no national police force. During the Weimar Republic, 1918 to 1933, each German state had its own police forces. Usually this included uniformed policemen, political policemen, and detectives. Though policemen had similar responsibilities and purposes in the various states and regions of the Weimar Germany, they also carried out tasks specific to their local communities and job descriptions. Being a uniformed policeman in Berlin was very different than a uniformed policeman in the countryside. Germany's police forces, and I'm going to skip a little bit here, Germany's police forces struggled to respond to the political disorder. They had to balance their own political inclinations, the freedom of the Weimar Republic, including freedom of speech and assembly, and their roles as guarantors of public order. Now, just to be clear here, are the two things that I've read here not extremely similar to exactly what we have here? Whenever we talk about this idea of, well, why doesn't America have a national police force? Why doesn't America have a national standard for law enforcement? It'd be so much easier if we just had everybody all linked together, and then if you want to work in Wyoming or Florida, it'd be easy to make that switch. Trust me, on that argument, that sounds good, right? Okay. Or we could have a national training standard. So law enforcement in Louisiana is getting the same training as the NYPD, nationalize it all, and then that way we can make sure we all hit the standard. Well, why do we not do that? Because this is one of those road signs that says this road could possibly lead to Naziville. And you look at that road sign and say, I don't want to go down that road. That looks scary to me. And then you turn another direction. That's why we don't have it here in America, because we don't want to go down this road. And when you think about, they had to balance their own political inclinations in the freedoms, like freedom of speech and assembly, and their role as guarantors of public order. Does that not sound very familiar to even some of the videos that I've shown in this podcast? So in 1936, Hitler appointed SS leader Heinrich Himmler as chief of German police, who centralized the police under his control. Himmler worked to merge the SS and the police together into one institution made up of different branches. New laws and decrees allowed the police to arrest, imprison, and torture people defined as enemies with impunity. In other words, they weren't held to any kind of punishment because these were enemies. These were people we had to go after. They're standing up against us. During World War II, the role of the German police radicalized. German police units were deployed alongside the military. Police units and order police battalions guarded ghettos, facilitated deportations, pursued Germany's enemies, crushed resistance movements, and carried out mass shootings of Jews and others. Couple more things. Now from an article, same site, German Police in the Nazi State. Nazification of the police could not happen overnight. In fact, it took several years. It was not until 1936 that the Nazis fully centralized all police forces under the SS leader Himmler's control. In early 1933, the Nazis used a variety of measures to free the police from the constraints of the Weimar Constitution. They simultaneously encouraged the police to target Nazism's political opponents, namely the Social Democrats and Communists. The most important step in the process of Nazifying the police came after February 27, 1933, when an arson attack destroyed the German Reichstag. The Reichstag fire, Hitler responded to the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil rights and most legal protections in Germany. It also expanded the power of the police. This decree, which remained in force until the downfall of the Nazi regime, laid the foundation for Germany to become a police state. That was the spark, literally, that lit the fuse. It was already being put in place, but now they had to respond to something. So that one moment, it all changed. See, whenever people make this, well, it could never happen here argument, and yet you're seeing this buildup and you're seeing this social tension and you're seeing these dangers all around, it may not be this. When it comes with its ugly head, I'm telling you right now, if we go down some of these roads in America and this republic falls and the Constitution is no longer adhered to and people just do whatever they want, with what we have made in technological advances, what we have in the way of weaponry, we're going to be worse than the Nazis ever thought they could be. They didn't have AI. They didn't have computers that not to this. I mean, that early IBM and stuff, that's a different conversation. But they didn't have what we have as resources. We're going to be worse than they ever could have imagined. Because the human heart is deceitfully wicked. Nothing changes. History repeats and it rhymes. In addition to expanding the powers of the police, the Nazis also wanted to guarantee the loyal, meaning Nazi, policemen controlled and filled the Germany's police institutions. This would make it easier for the Nazis to use the police forces for their ideological and dictatorial goals. The Nazis did not simply abolish the police or replace them all with Nazis. They needed the existing police experience, knowledge, skill, and expertise. Police leadership positions were politically appointed. This meant that whoever controlled the state and local governments could appoint the police chiefs. As the Nazis gained control of the state and local government positions, then they immediately appointed those that were loyal to these police leadership positions. The same men who had been terrorizing the police and the public just months before were now in charge of major police departments. While most German policemen did not lose their jobs, this did not mean that nothing changed within Germany's police forces. The Nazis used other personal measures, namely reorganization and personal transfers, to create Nazified police organizations. Nazi policemen were promoted or transferred to prominent positions, while politically unreliable policemen were given administrative duties or less influential roles. In other words, the culture changed, right? In the 1930s, Nazi police units remade police culture to align with Nazi values. This was part of their plan to create a National Socialist form of policing. Propaganda efforts tried to improve the public image of the police. Beginning in 1934, celebrations called the Day of the German Police honored the connection between the police and the people with parades and speeches. During those events, which eventually expanded to a full week, German policemen stood on street corners and collected money for the Nazi charity program Winter Relief. Propaganda depicted German policemen directing traffic, returning lost children, shaking hands with people, and teaching children new skills. I mean, today, I'm sure maybe they'd be making TikTok videos and, water challenges. Here's what I want to say. We all know the dangers of going down some of these roads. We all know where they can lead. So what can we do differently? I had a great message from somebody, and they seemed really interested in what I was saying, and they DM'd me, and we got into a little bit of conversation about it. And they said, police and law enforcement systems are so different that an officer can stand for integrity, but ultimately it's either suck it up or quit. And then they said, what can we do specifically to change this? And they said, you talk in so many generalizations. So first, let me address the generalizations, right? I have to talk in generalizations because of what I just talked about with, thank God, we don't have a national police force. So what one person's experience in one state, in one county, in one city is going to be completely different than somebody else's. So depending on who you are and where you are, what you should do for you personally is different. But there are some commonalities that I think come to the forefront when we talk about a divided nation and what we do about it. So first of all, I want to talk about what are the things that law enforcement can do to safeguard itself, right? Well, one of them is prioritizing life, and that's the life of everybody, right? That's the lives of those that we serve. We have to prioritize life. From the dangers that I just read about from the 1930s, one of the things is that it created these people are inferior. These people, they're worthless eaters. These people, we don't need them anymore. Society doesn't need them. And because society doesn't need them, we don't care about their life. We only care about these lives. So anytime you hear a conversation where people are making those kind of things, and I could show you news story after news story after news story that are modern news stories that go down these very roads and law enforcement being involved in it. So start with law enforcement must prioritize life, and you as an individual must prioritize life. And if you're at an agency that's starting to talk this way or in a state that's starting to talk this way, then that needs to be a red flag. The second thing is we cannot allow for an us versus them mentality. But let me explain this, right? Because there is an us versus them in more of a global understanding, right? For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, right? So there is a spiritual component to a lot of what we're seeing, and there is actual evil out there. So when you're talking about good versus evil, that's different. When we're talking about us as law enforcement against them, the civilians, that's a problem. Because there isn't an us versus them. We need to start in this country prioritizing unity over diversity. It's e pluribus unum. It is this concept that we are one people, that we come together. We have differences, sure. You and I aren't going to agree on the same things. I think blue is a better color than green. I don't know. Whatever it is, we have differences. Maybe I like my steak medium, and you're like, if it isn't bleeding, it's not good steak. Okay. Those are differences. There's nothing wrong with differences. The problem is that there are things we absolutely must agree on. The major protection to the United States. What makes us different? And again, this podcast, I'm trying to keep it 30 minutes. I could go on for 5 hours about this, but what makes America different? And we could talk about the founding, and we could talk about the Pilgrims, and we could talk about these principles that the founders were looking at, and they were looking at these other systems, and they're like, this doesn't work. We saw this republic fall apart. We saw what paganism leads to. We saw all these things, and even the founders were like, I don't even have a Christian foundation. I don't believe in God. But I know that these principles are true because I've seen them historically. So what is the protection in the United States, right? To avoid this atrocity here, the potential for atrocity, we have a Constitution and we have a Bill of Rights. And you as law enforcement have a duty to uphold them. And you have a duty to uphold them over any other edict. And that's where the rub comes in. That's where this question of, well, it's so different. If someone stands up for integrity, if someone chooses to do the right thing, they either have to suck it up or quit. And I understand that, but quite frankly, maybe it's quit. And I know, Wayne, you don't understand my situation. I've got kids and I've got grandkids, or I've got a wife and I've got this house and the family's lived here and we love California. Oh, sorry. We love this state, whatever state it is. Well, this is where you have to decide what you actually believe. I have friends and loved ones who live in states that I don't understand why they live in those states. If you live in that state, your vote doesn't count. It just doesn't. That state is going to continue to vote against most American ideals. So why do you live there? Now, I get there are situations we can't get out of. I'm not in a financial situation where I could just easily up and move. So I find myself constantly in this kind of introspection, right? If you're in a great area, if you work for a great agency, if you're with like-minded people who are seeking this unity and seek to follow the Constitution and the laws of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, laws that have been properly enacted, if those are the people that you surround yourself with, thank God for it and encourage that. Hope that it grows. Keep an informed citizenry, right? So are the foundational principles of the Declaration of Independence, are the principles of the Constitution, Bill of Rights, are they ingrained in you, right? Do you understand your role of why governments were instituted among men? Do you understand that you as a law enforcement officer, your role is to protect the rights? And you're like, yeah, but I make arrest, and if someone does something, I put them in handcuffs, and I inhibit their rights. I take them to jail, or if somebody attempts to use deadly force, then I respond in kind, and then their right to life is taken. But no. That's exactly it. You're protecting the rights of the citizens. See, we are fulfilling that role that we step in and say, hey, listen, you're not going to be able to infringe on their rights. And so we're protecting the rights of the citizenry by taking action in those moments. Do you know, support, live by, defend, and uphold the Constitution? And then, to the point I was making, are you surrounding yourself with people who are calling to suspend the Constitution for some sort of greater good? Or are you around people that are like, no matter what, I'm going to hold to it? Because we're starting to see this in certain parts of the country. You're starting to see certain states coming out with edicts, coming out with laws, coming out with rules that are clearly unconstitutional. Who do you think that they're going to be asking to enforce that? What do you do? What do you do? This is where it's like, well, we speak in generalizations, but I don't know what to tell you specifically to do in your situation. But what I encourage you to do is to know what you believe and why you believe it. Right? We all have to make this decision, and it requires introspection, and it requires quiet, and it requires maybe going back and reading the Constitution. Have you read it recently? Have you read the Declaration of Independence? Have you gone back through these documents and said, wow, man, it has been a long time since I read this, but let me take a look at this again and just kind of get some idea, and have you read maybe the Federalist Papers? Have you, do you know why you believe what you believe? If you're a person of faith, have you spent time in prayer? Have you spent time thinking about, okay, what is my role and what is my expectation for me to do? Because you say you believe something, and then when things aren't even all that hard yet, you don't want to stand up for it. Yeah, you don't want to speak out. Yeah, you don't want to say something like, hey, no, this isn't acceptable. We don't do that here. If you won't do that now, and we start, and sadly, this country continues on the path it's on, and the degradation continues, and we move further and further away from a constitutional system, and things get crazier and crazier, where do you think you're going to be? Do you think you're just going to wake up one day and stand up then? Is that what's going to happen? Is just all of a sudden you're going to grow a spine? No. That isn't how it happens. It is the slow erosion over time. Going back to those articles, it didn't happen overnight. It took years. It's because they allowed, they kept giving ground and giving ground and giving ground, not knowing what they actually believe, not prioritizing life, not saying, no, this is absolutely true and I know it to be absolutely true, and I will not go over the cliff with the rest of society because I know that this is the right thing to do. You as law enforcement, me as law enforcement, we have the ability to save the republic. When it comes to all these issues, knowing truth, speaking truth, being willing to stand up. If you're at an agency that you feel is unrecoverable, you feel like you're not going to be able to make the changes, then go to another agency. Well, it's not easy. It's hard. Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, it probably is hard. It probably is going to require moving. Well, I want this job, or, we got family nearby. Okay. But then don't come to me and say, well, I'm going to stand up. We put all these crazy signs on our vehicles and, all these bumper sticker quotes of, I'm going to stand up. We're all, going to win the cold civil war or whatever. You're not fighting in any battle. You're a keyboard warrior, as I pointed out, and you're not really doing anything other than just feeling good about yourself because you made some snide comment and somebody responded to your snide comment. So I want to end with this thought. We've said lots that we talked about, but the bottom line is this for me. I honestly believe that law enforcement officers have the ability to save the republic. If the ranks of law enforcement are filled with men and women who believe in the Constitution, who believe in the Bill of Rights, who believe in the sanctity of human life, who believe in protecting the most vulnerable among us, whose sole role is to help the citizenry that they are able to take care of. If they are truly humble and that they approach it from a spirit of service and they are willing to give of themselves for others, then we avoid the road. We stay completely away from that road. But if by contrast, we have men and women who are like, we don't need the Constitution anymore. You know what? The Bill of Rights, that's antiquated language. We don't need that. We're all about diversification. We're all about not hiring people on the merit of who's most qualified. We're going to hire them based on some other criterion, be it skin color, be it orientation, whatever the case might be. That's the criterion we want. Those are roads that are dangerous. They create the us versus them mentality. That you're not standing for anything, allowing you then to be given away to wherever that wind is blowing, wherever you're going. Don't be that person. Be men and women of merit. Be men and women of character. Be men and women who are willing to stand up in their families, stand up in their communities, stand up in their churches. Be those men and women. Because then you and I, we can save this republic. All this craziness you're hearing, all this insanity that permeates social media, we can rise above it. You and I, we can be that difference. That's where I want to leave it. That does it for this week's Morning Roll Call. I'll see you next Thursday in the interview room, the following Monday in Morning Roll Call. But between now and then, as in every day, I'll see you out there on the blue line.